It's nice to see some faces I know very well, but it's even nicer to see lots of faces that are new to me. And if you are new to me, then I am new to you. So I'm just going to say a few things about myself and my work on things related to the War on Terror, much of which relates to this book, which is called Shadow Lives, The Forgotten Women of the War on Terror. And it deals with women from families that some of you know, like Shaka's family, and also women who have had families on control orders, and also some women in America whose cases you'll probably be less familiar with, but they all fit into one pattern. And I just want to say a little bit about the background of this book for those of you who don't know me. This book was not a journalistic project. When I started being involved with women who turn out to be in the book, it was as a kind of byproduct of a play called Guantanamo, Honor Bound to Defend Freedom, which I had been involved in doing the interviews with the families of people who had disappeared into Guantanamo or Bagram or Kandahar. And at that point, in 2003, you may not remember that nobody knew anything about these people, or why they were there, or who they were. And when we did the research, we relied upon the lawyers to put us in touch with the families, because some of you may remember those headlines of the Tipton Taliban and things like that, which meant, obviously, that none of these families wanted to have anything to do with anybody who was a journalist, anything to do with the media whatsoever. But when we had finished, when we did the play and it was ready, I wrote to a couple of families, one in particular, a Palestinian family, who had declined through her lawyer to have anything to do with the play. She didn't want to be interviewed. And I just wrote her a letter saying, we've written this play, and we hope by the dramatizing of the cases that we've written about, we will be able to prick consciences and maybe make a tiny contribution towards enough indignation to close Guantanamo and end these aspects of the War on Terror. Well, obviously we were completely wrong in our optimism. But I still think that the use of art of whatever sort, whether it's a play, whether it's paintings, whether it's poetry, and many of you will have read the poems of the men from Guantanamo, and if you haven't, I strongly recommend you can get those books on Amazon. And this book is in the same category. It's aiming to humanize people who've been completely dehumanized, and only by doing that can we change the climate within this country. I don't want to say too much about Shaka's wife. She's a friend of mine, and I've been visiting her and her family for these many years now. And I would never have imagined, and I don't think any of us who were involved at the beginning imagined that 11 years on we would still be in this situation. And when you think today of the 166 people who are still in Guantanamo Bay, and you put that together with 157 of them have no charges against them, and you put that against the figure of 87 of them, like Shaka, have actually been cleared, are completely innocent, the idea that they are still there should be bringing people out on the streets in indignation in enormous numbers. We haven't managed to crack the mobilization that we should have done. And no disrespect to those of you in this room who I know spend your entire working life and your non-working life on this issue. We have to do better. We have to do things differently. And again, that's partly why I wrote the book. Now, very often when I give a talk on the book or on this kind of issues, particularly when it's in universities, I ask how many people in the room have a direct knowledge of the impact of the war on terror. And very often I get something like an 80% response. And that can be all kinds of different people. For instance, there was reference earlier by John to this removal of British citizenship. Well, if you talk to anybody in the Somali community, young people in the Somali community, you will find not only people getting stripped of their citizenship and one of their number now being on trial in America, well, he hasn't got to trial yet, without the rights of being a British citizen, but you will hear about young men who are constantly asked by the security services to talk about each other. And when you think that this has become something that's normal in our society, I think it's, again, we couldn't have imagined 10 years ago that we would be targeting particularly vulnerable groups in our society like this in a way which destroys their sense of security, their sense of a future, their sense of how they want to live and what they can contribute to society. And particularly, I think, for all young Muslims, there is a very, very big challenge like this. But I want particularly to highlight the question of young Somalis, because I think that it's a story that's not well enough known. Part of the reason that it's not well enough known is to do with fear. And one of the very serious things that happened after 9/11, when Mr. Bush famously said everything was different, the gloves are off and so on, within our society there was a deliberate attempt by the media, but also by the authorities themselves, to create fear. Fear of Muslims for the majority community, and fear within the Muslim community of what your neighbour might or might not be doing or have done. And one of the reasons I never thought to do this book is that it's actually a book about women's friendships. And the women that I've written about here, these are not interviews, these are my friends. I have been with them now, some of them 6 years, some of them 8, 9 years. And they come from communities where privacy and dignity are extremely important. I never thought about writing anything about them until a few years ago. 1 or 2 of them began to say, "Aren't you supposed to be a writer? How come you don't write our stories?" And I said, "How come you don't write your stories?" And they said, "We've forgotten." Several of them said to me, "I've forgotten so many things, but you know, you can remember when my husband was taken to Broadmoor. You can remember when my husband had not written to me from Guantanamo for 5 years. I can't remember the details of any of it, and I want you to write it down." So this book is a collective effort, and what I've done is I've put it in the context of the history of the war on terror, because I think there are so many parts of the narrative that have been completely glossed over by the kind of dominant Western media narrative that we all know. Just give you one example. There's a very important book by a man called Zaif. Who knows who is Zaif in this room? Okay, one person. Excellent. I hope you'll all rush and get this book afterwards. Zaif was the Taliban ambassador to Pakistan at the time of 9/11. He was the person who was intimately involved in trying to prevent the attack on Afghanistan. And the detail of what he gives you in that book, of the offers that the Taliban made to the Americans for an independent Muslim trial for Osama bin Laden over the case of 9/11, is completely airbrushed out of most people's knowledge of the period. And I just give you that as one tiny example. And I have copiously footnoted the introduction of this book because I think there are many of you who want to know more about the context in which this happened. And so many good people have written good things, but they have not been brought sufficiently to people's attention. And I think that between us all, we can make a much more powerful case for the illegalities that John has spoken about, the absolute horror of Guantanamo, the scandal that it's still alive, and the fact that Shaka is not back with us. And I'm going to stop there before you take 5 more minutes. I'm going to stop now with just a plea for all of us to feel encouraged by the women who have so heroically held on to their families and held on to a sense of dignity and a sense of joy through the horror of what's happened to them. And we have to replicate that in our attempts at working on these issues. So thank you very much for listening to me. And if anyone wants to buy the book, as you can see, I've got 4 of them here.
Thank you very much, Victoria. If I can just reap on the appeal basis, we are here to remember one man who's incarcerated, who has been incarcerated for 11 years without charge or trial. Also cleared under the Bush administration and Obama administration, yet he remains detained. Shaka Arma, we do have the petition here today, so please do sign. I will actually hand the microphone to Azim Qureshi, who is the research director of Caged Prisoners. Thank you very much.
I just want to start off by saying that I've now been fortunate or unfortunate enough to be working against the war on terror at Guantanamo for the last 10 years, and I still consider myself a student of Victoria. She has a way of bringing the dignity of people who have suffered out in a way that I've never known throughout the whole course of my work, and my work is to bring their stories out, you know. So I encourage every single person in this room to buy this book. It's absolutely brilliant. Victoria's going to probably tell me off afterwards for saying all of that, but it's an absolute must. It has to be a part of your book collection, if nothing else, that you buy this year. So having said that, I want to start talking about why it is that working against Guantanamo is so important. And unfortunately, many people don't really think about the impact that Guantanamo has had on a global scale. You know, I've traveled around large parts of the world interviewing people who have been directly impacted by the detentions in Guantanamo Bay, whether it was in Bosnia, in Pakistan, in the Horn of Africa, and across Europe. And basically, for me, it comes down to this. Guantanamo has entered our psyche in a way that it's become the very symbol of arbitrary detention. I remember being in the northeast corner of Kenya, in a place called Dadaab, refugee camp, in a place called Hagdera. And while I was there, I met a group of Somalis who had been interned in this refugee camp for about 17 years. And when I asked them, you know, how do you describe being interned for so long? The chairman of the refugee camp said to me, the best way that I can describe it is that it's like being in Guantanamo Bay. You know, for me, what their situation was far worse. I mean, 17 years is an extremely long time. This is back in 2007. So it had been, you know, it's even longer since then. But it was amazing that they chose that as their reference point, as if, you know, everything is now being held up to Guantanamo as a symbol of arbitrary detention. And you know, you hear about people who now talk about the Guantanamization of laws. Bernard Dock, famous German lawyer, once used that phrase about German immigration policy. He said it's the Guantanamization of German immigration policy. And then you see the brothers who are being detained in prisons in the UK. They refer to Long Lartin prison as being Long Guantanamo, because for them this is what the symbol was now. That Guantanamo has become that symbol for arbitrary detention worldwide. And it's important that we actually remind ourselves of that. That Guantanamo, it's a terrible place. It's not, by far it's not the worst prison in the war on terror. Trust me, it's not. There are places in Syria, in Jordan, in other places that are equally or more horrifying. The kind of places that none of us ever want to even hear about, let alone know that they exist. But the reality is that they are not being the ones that are held up as this symbol of arbitrary detention. And that's because the US has a certain position in everybody's minds. It has a certain kind of authority that, you know, if America's getting away with it, then basically it's okay for everyone else. They're setting the standard. And that's why we need to hold America to account for Guantanamo. That's what makes it so important. More so than the Syrians, more so than the Pakistanis. Because nobody's thinking to themselves, oh, well, if Pakistan's doing it, it's okay. Everybody's saying, well, Pakistan needs to stop that because it's wrong. But America sets the standard for the rest of the world. And when I think of Shakir Amir, and, you know, subhanAllah, I've never wanted to meet a man so much in my life. You know, you spend so many years working on somebody's case in whatever way you can, in whatever small way that you can, thinking about them, even writing about them. And you think to yourself that it's time. It's just time now. It's time for these people to be released. It's time for this person to come home. But nothing ever seems to be enough. But that shouldn't stop our efforts. You know, when you think about the fact that Shakir was detained on the 13th, or sent to Guantanamo on the 13th of February 2002, that's a long time. You know, it's almost too much time to bear. But the thing is, and this is something that Victoria has done so well, that she's brought out the dignity of these families and the way that they've dealt with this. The fact is that they haven't given up, and that means neither should we. Because they're in a much weaker position than we are. You know, we don't have these kinds of you know, thoughts in our head all the time about, okay, you know, when's our father going to come home? We have the freedom to act. And, you know, for me, when I think about Shakir, I think about my own life. And there's a famous saying of the Prophet in Islam where he said that the Muslim is a mirror to another Muslim. And when I think about this saying, I think about people who are less fortunate than myself. And I think this is what this saying means. That when I put up a mirror on Shakir's life against my own, and I think about my life since 2002, since February 2002, if I had been in Shakir's position, what does it mean for me? It means I never had a law degree. It means I never achieved my master's. It means I never got married to my wife. It means I never had my 2 children. It means I never wrote a book. It means that I never got to travel around half of the world, meeting some of the most incredible people. It means some of the strongest people you're ever likely to meet. It means I would never have built a friendship with Victoria. It means all of those things at the same time. That's what 11 years means to me. And this is what I hope that we all begin to do. That when we think about these detainees in the war on terror, that we don't just think about them as being poor unfortunate souls, that we think about what that detention would have meant to our own lives, how it would have impacted on us individually. Because when you start to take stock of your own life, when viewing the difficulty that somebody else has gone through, then you start to realize what 11 years means. It doesn't just mean 11 years. It means so much more than that. And so this is my basic plea, that I want everybody in this room to think about Sharka's 11 years, but use it as fuel to think about how you would want to respond to that, how you as a family member would want to actually deal with that situation. And I think my 10 minutes is up, so I just want to leave you with that thought, really. And I'm sorry I didn't cover everything that you asked me to, but I think that's good enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it is interesting to point out that 100% male detainees in Guantanamo and 100% Muslim detainees, I thought that was just an interesting point to bring up. We're going to bring the focus back to Obama's promise to close Guantanamo 4 years ago. His promise has been unfulfilled. Who better to address this than London campaigner Aisha Minar, the founder of the London Guantanamo campaign.
I'd just like to say just a bit about our campaign. We've actually been running since March 2006, so we've been around for the last 7 years working on the closure of Guantanamo Bay. We also work on extraordinary rendition, so it's not just Guantanamo. As Hassan said, there's Guantanamo, but it's just the tip of the iceberg, and there's other places like Bagram in Afghanistan, also been open for over 11 years. There's other secret prisons around the world as well, and they are of concern, so we try and do as much as we can. I'm an activist, I'm not really a speaker, so I'm not here to give you a fancy speech. I'm actually here to tell you what it is that you should be doing. Okay, so if you're feeling a bit comfortable and you don't want to hear these kind of things, now might be a good time to leave. Okay, so I mean, you could have stayed at home, you could have watched the BBC News, you could have watched Channel 4 News or Sky News and learnt about the things that the government would like you to know, but you chose to be here instead. And knowledge is power, and with power comes responsibility, and it's your responsibility to take action. One of the things I don't think that has been mentioned today is the fact of what's actually happening at Guantanamo Bay right now. The vast majority of prisoners are on hunger strike. Again, this is something that the mainstream media has completely and utterly ignored. The more liberal, the so-called left-wing Guardian newspaper gave it a comment piece. It's in comment is free. You know, along with the comments about some film stars dress at some premiere and some pop star being late by 5 minutes or something like that. That's the kind of news it is. It wasn't a news item. It wasn't worthy of being considered news. Because currently, nearly all the prisons at Guantanamo Bay are on hunger strike. They have been since the beginning of last month. But this isn't considered a newsworthy item. And for the American government, which has also been ignoring this, slowly over the last couple of weeks, it started off with, there were 6 men on hunger strike. Then it became 14 men, and currently they have admitted that the original number has gone up to 24. So they are admitting there is something going on at Guantanamo Bay. Instead of admitting that there's a hunger strike, they admitted that back in January they fired plastic bullets. And again, while this was admitted in the United States newspapers, this wasn't taken up as an issue. Nobody seemed to bother that riot control methods like firing plastic bullets, which can be lethal by the way, were used against prisoners. What does this say about what's going on? Over the past 11 years, as has been mentioned by some of the other speakers, Guantanamo Bay hasn't got as much of media coverage, as much attention as it should have got. So things like a hunger strike are not seen as being important. Having said that, Palestinian prisoners on hunger strike is not important either. An asylum seeker can die on hunger strike in a detention centre in this country, and that will never make the papers. So generally speaking, it's not just hunger strikes. Nobody's interested in those. But other things have happened at Guantanamo Bay. Very, very important things. If the war on terror is the reason for Guantanamo Bay to exist, then very recently in the past few months, this should be of interest to law students, the whole military commission system has fallen apart. But again, that hasn't really been something of interest that anybody should really take an interest in. As a campaign, what we tend to do is we stand outside in public and we talk to the public about what's happening in Guantanamo Bay. So one of the main things that we have people coming up to us and asking us and saying to us, in fact, there's two things. One, oh, didn't Obama close it back in 2010? If he did, I can honestly tell you I would not be here right now, okay? And some of my colleagues who very kindly spent most of today raising awareness between Birbeck and SOAS, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't have been here all day either. So, no, he didn't. It's still open. There's still 166 prisoners. On top of that, the other thing people always ask us, what is Obama going to do? Back 2 years ago, when it was the first anniversary of Obama having broken his promise to close Guantanamo Bay by the beginning of 2010, I wrote an article in Open Democracy, and I ended off by saying that don't expect President Obama to do anything. For very long, in fact for the past 11 years, the responsibility has fallen on civil society. Governments have really not played their part, not just the American government, but all governments. It really is down to NGOs like cage prisoners, journalists like Victoria, the lawyers who mainly work pro bono on these issues, and grassroots campaigns like our own. And we work with campaigns in Ireland, in the United States, in Canada, in other parts of the world. It's really up to us. One of the other things is, when people ask, what is it that Obama will do, is that it's very nice to blame the United States. The United States has become the bogeyman of the 21st century, and with good reason. I'm not saying that you know, people dislike the United States without a good reason. However, we do not tend to look at what it is that we ourselves do. 4 years ago, we held an event called Extraordinary Rendition on Trial, and one of our speakers was Phil Shiner, who's currently taking the Iraq torture cases through the courts. Now, he said that the problem in this country is that we always blame the Americans. It's what the Americans did in Iraq, it's what the Americans do in Afghanistan, it's what the Americans do in Guantanamo. But what about the responsibility of the British government? So why are we campaigning in this country? Because we have a government that we have to hold responsible as well for the things that they have done. If Shakarama has been in Guantanamo Bay for the last 11 years, that's not just Barack Obama's fault. What about our own Prime Minister? What is he doing? Where is David Cameron on this issue? Where is William Hague? One of the first things Gordon Brown did when he became Prime Minister was write to Condoleezza Rice and ask for 5 men to come back. They've all come back. The last one was Binyan Mohammed, and that was over 4 years ago. Now there's only Shakarama. Why? Why can't the government answer a simple question like, why can't he come back here? It's not such a